So this morning I'm going to continue part 3 of this series, Big Mind Help. This is how Big Mind Help for small-minded times. Today, my sermon is on my Big Chief pad. Actually, I was in the mood for writing out an outline and try to get this all done within 10 to 12 minutes, but I've told the band at 5 till, wherever I am, they're going to walk up. That'll be my cue. Wrap it up, buddy. So we've been on this 3-part series, and this is part 3. In the first part, we were looking at this idea of what it means to have the eyes of God. What do we mean by when we talk about this big mind? And I mentioned that even the mention of eyes of God, we talk about sacred language, and even sacred language carries some baggage for all of us. We all bring familiarity, and sometimes that's uncomfortable familiarity, sometimes it's comforting familiarity, but we all bring this baggage to these words. And so even when we come present in a community, we come with, even if we're trying not to be, we come with a level of judgment, right? We come with a level of critical assessment. It's so hard not to do that. It's literally in our DNA. And yet it is, if you read our text this morning, clearly Jesus is saying, overcome your DNA. He's inviting us to sort of move past what is so natural for us. In fact, I would go ahead and just say up front that these 2 verses to me perfectly illustrate how Jesus is more of a contemplative and a mystic, and how Paul is more of a sort of an administrator, more of a programmatic sort of orientation, a little more of a concrete, a dualist, if you will, whereas Jesus is more of a non-dualist, just by virtue of what he's saying here. So that was our first part. How do we see? And the very word contemplate in its Latin roots, as we talked about how that's oftentimes we think of contemplation as sort of this prayerful state, sort of this reflective state. But in fact, contemplation has to do with how we see. William James said, we behave according to what we... William James is the American psychologist, the turn of the 20th century. We behave according to how we attend, to what we attend. So we behave, we act out of what we attend to. And yet we don't really think that much about what we attend to. But a contemplative, the word contemplate means, how do we see? It means to look at the way we see. Literally changing or challenging or opening our worldview, the way in which we see things, is what it means to be a contemplative. And then we talked last week about seeing funny, and I tried to tell a few jokes, which kind of fell flat, and then we had some fun. Claire got up here and told some jokes with me, and she, rocked the house, and so that was great. And but we talked about the power of what a joke is, because even Jesus' parables have this format to them that at first sounds like a setup. It sounds like a joke almost, and the joke's on the Pharisees, or the joke's on the ruling sort of religious leaders who are exclusivist, and yet at the same time, as by the time the parable's over, his listeners are going, wait a minute, I think the joke's on us too. I mean, what Jesus did was sort of a typical approach to what a joke is, which is to start with orientation, what's familiar, and then to disorient, and then to reorient. And usually in a joke, it's sort of synthesis, right? It just sort of comes back and it makes sense. Oh, now I see how A and B fit, and it equals C. And that makes sense. A parable doesn't do that. A parable doesn't sort of come back to synthesis. What a parable does is it completely reorients you. If you're really listening, if you have those who have ears to hear, for example, as Jesus was always telling his listeners, it reorients the way you see things. It challenges everything. So we thought about how we talked about seeing funny. Rumi has this wonderful poem, which we've often said in here many times. This being human is a guest house. Many of you remember this. I don't have it memorized. But it starts off with, this house, this life that we live is but a guest house. This being human is but a guest house. So when something comes to the door, whether it's a problem, whether it's an obstacle, whether it's a fear, whether it's a love, whether it's a compassion, whether it's an enemy, invite them in. For all of these things, strangers unaware, they may be in fact angels unaware that have something for us. So this idea of moving beyond comfort this idea of disowning what we own, right? That's a total reorientation with how we think about things. So today we're talking about surrender, and it's an interesting, careful kind of subject. I have to be a little sensitive with it, because what I want to avoid is this idea that I'm saying give up or give in, especially in our culture where surrender is sort of like a bad word, you know. I remember when I used to play racquetball, Linda would always get mad at me when I'd play racquetball. I mean, she'd actually cheer for me when I was playing in college. But she'd say, you gave up halfway into it. And I said, I really didn't mean to give up. I was winning, and so I started to kind of just let back a little bit. And then I'd lose. And she'd say, well, why would you do that? And I said, well, because it was just sort of like at some point it was not as much fun. But then competition has never been sort of one of my, or ambitiousness has never been one of my personal sort of core values. And that's not to say that it's not a good thing. I want to suggest to you that when I mention our DNA, we can be really thankful that we have generations and generations of stubborn ancestors. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, right? I mean, stubborn, fearful, angry, whatever it took, that whole flight or fight kind of basic genetic background has preserved our race, has gotten many of us to where we are here. As we heard from Carol earlier, and as we know personally from many of us in my own background, sometimes there's a lot of negative baggage that comes with that defiant, ambitious, competitive, out of control sometimes genetics. And we still find ourselves here, and we kind of adjust and adapt in spite of that. But that's who we are. That's what we are as humans. The interesting thing, though, is in the 21st century, we don't need Stone Age mentality, right? In the 21st century, we don't need to have that fear of a saber-toothed tiger coming and eating us. And yet we still act in life like that's the case. We hear in debates, when we hear a debate, what is the go-to thing that our different parties go to? At some point, they always back off, and they always fall back on the fear factor, right? They always fall back on the fear factor. And if they're not immediately saying, we got to watch out because ISIS is at our back door at any moment, that's not as popular a phrase to use now because it doesn't seem quite as relevant. Right? For a while there, it was easy to get away with saying it because we were all terrified that the next crowd was going to be a bombing. The next gathering on ISIS was going to show up out of nowhere. But now, all we do is we mention a name. And that carries all the baggage with it. We say, well, this person's a Clinton supporter. And then that carries the baggage, and everybody's kind of reacting. Or we say, well, this person doesn't support gun control. And that carries all the baggage, and everybody associates with that baggage, and next thing you know is we're operating again out of that Stone Age mentality. And we're in the 21st century. One of my favorite writers, Marilyn Robinson, she wrote a book, and now I can't remember what it's called, something essays, but she's an essayist, so that was kind of a dumb thing. But at any rate, she writes wonderful essays. And one of them she wrote, here we are in the 21st century operating out of primeval mindsets with our hands ready at the nuclear buttons and our ingenuity creating artificial intelligence. And yet we're operating mostly from the amygdala. Does that not scare you? I mean, when Jesus says to his listeners, love your enemy, what the devil is he really saying there? What does he really mean by that phrase? It seems really hard for us to find ourselves at this place and to find ourselves at this idea of loving our enemy. So I'm going to suggest a couple of ideas on how we get there. First of all, I'm going to quote Jerry Garcia. Okay? Now, Jerry Garcia, right, the band leader for the Grateful Dead, whose song we just sang. Just side note, by the way, I love this song that we sing. We don't do it very often. It kind of leans into this country style, and I'm not really a fan of country, and so, but it goes there, right? We can't avoid it, and that's where the Grateful Dead often went, was that country rock. But we were doing this. Brad and I were doing this at a conference event a couple of years ago, big conference worship event. Bunch of church people came up afterwards and were saying, "That's beautiful. You know, I'd never seen that in our praise worship selections. You know, what is that song?" And I said, "Well, the song's called Ripple. You know, the stuff you get cheap at 7-Eleven, and it's by the Grateful Dead." And then they just kind of shrink away, and they're like. You know, it's that whole, and you guys know what we do in here is that we do secular music. We do a lot of other music, sacred music, secular music, but we do what Jesus did. We take the unexpected and we look at it from all angles because it reminds us that there is sacredness in all things. And so we look at a song like Natural, and suddenly we're thinking, yeah, that's kind of the stance. That's the way we orient ourselves in our culture, is this stone-cold, rock-hard, fearless kind of personality, you know. But look at the trouble that gets us into, right? And so now that's our starting point. Now we got to think about, what does this mean when we face this every day? That's the kind of way we approach things in here. So here's Jerry Garcia. He says, to get really high in life is to lose yourself. But to lose oneself is to see fully everything else. Okay, so first of all, get past the idea of getting really high and think instead of, what does it mean to lose yourself? Now back up and think, what does it mean to get really high? Because our minds might go first to, well, is he talking about, you know, pot and weed and, you know, psychedelics, and I'm sure there's all of that involved in there too. But go talk to anyone. Linda and I were in New Mexico a few years back, and a Richard Rohr event was going on in Albuquerque, and we were in Santa Fe, and there were a couple of former Olympic medalists from the 1970s, late 70s, who were there staying at this B&B, and they were sort of working on coaching and working with Richard Rohr and developing some programs. And we asked them, so what is it? I mean, you guys must be really disciplined. And the woman looked over and said, there's a lot of discipline, but he had something I couldn't get to, because she didn't ever place, but her husband did. And we said, what is that? And she said, he lost himself in his competition. He would lose himself. And I could never get there because I was always anxious. But he lost himself. When you lose yourself, you experience that kind of high. That's what Jerry Garcia is talking about. But to lose yourself also suddenly means you begin to see everything more fully. This idea of letting go. So how do we do that? Well, okay, so this last week, I don't know how many of you participated in North Texas Giving. I mean, we are beginning a stewardship campaign. I'm going to talk a little bit about giving just very quickly. I had a wonderful experience. Normally, Linda and I often sit down and we look at our budget and we talk about what we need to save, and then we look at what's at the top and we go, yeah, we can get rid of this. We can kind of do that, right? We got this much we can spare. But we didn't do that this time. We never even talked. And I kept thinking of all the things I believe in and all the things I'm excited about. Some of the nonprofits I have sort of a little bit of a hand in just because I know the people or whatever. And then I just got busy doing other things. And then about 15 minutes till midnight, I'm doing dishes. I was supposed to do them at 10:30, but I watched a movie instead. So I was doing my dishes, and I was looking up, and all of a sudden I realized it's 15 till midnight, and I suddenly realized I haven't done any of that. So I got down on the computer, and I started typing it up really quick, and I was looking at what I was going to give away, and I was trying to think to myself, how much can I give away? And I couldn't really even I don't know. We didn't talk about it. So I just threw out random numbers. You know, and then I thought, no, wait a minute. That's because I'm just doing what's comfortable. And I just decided, I'm going to triple that. And so I put triple that amount. Now, I'm not going to tell you how much that was. I started out with $2. It was $6 in the end, and it wasn't a big deal. No, I went to where it was actually uncomfortable. And I did that because I wanted to simply experiment with something. How hard it is to let go of stuff. Just stuff. And you know, how much stuff do I waste all the time, right? So how hard is it to let go? So I did that. And here's the funny thing. So I did that with all of them. And then the next day, I told Linda, and I said, you forgot to talk. I was like, blaming. I said, you forgot to talk to me about, our giving thing. So, and she looked at me and she said, oh, I gave. And the funny thing was that she was doing the exact same thing. She was like, I just decided not to think about it. I just decided, here's what I want to give. And that's what she ended up doing. And this idea of letting go of stuff is such a challenge because we think in terms of protection. We think in terms of guarding, right? And it goes into everything. It goes into our emotions. It goes into our relationships. It goes into our possessions. So that's the first thing I think we have to challenge is this idea of letting go. All right, I'm going to finish in just a minute. But the last thing I want to suggest to you is this idea of loving your neighbor and how we begin to let go there. And I won't say a lot. We'll get into it some more in the next couple of weeks because we're going to keep coming back to this idea of letting go, of surrender, right? It's not a giving up. It literally is losing yourself. When you fall in love with someone, you don't sit down and calculate all of the different things that you're going to involve in, and you're going to sort of calculate how much you're going to give into this. You fall, right? You just fall. When it's really there, you just fall. And if you really want to experience the depth of that relationship, you have to lose yourself in that relationship. And it's on both sides. You just have to be willing to go there. So this idea of Nelson Mandela, when he was in prison, he was in prison for 27 years, oppressed by white apartheid. And when he was finally freed, you remember what he did? He got out. He didn't look for revenge. He didn't look for justice. He formed an organization called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? And he said he was doing so because of this word that really came to light to him as he was in prison. He didn't use the opportunity to get angry. He used the opportunity to lose himself. These aren't his words necessarily, but that's clearly what he was doing. He was losing himself so that he could get out of the way to something bigger than black or white, something bigger than either or, something bigger than this or that. He was losing himself. And he remembered a word that he'd always heard as a child, which was Ubuntu. And you know what Ubuntu means, right? You said it to one another. I am because of you. Ubuntu, I am because of you. Ubuntu is this idea that recognizes, that acknowledges from the start, right at the very ground of our being, that we are interconnected, that we are, as Thich Nhat Hanh would say, we exist in interbeing. Not one thing we do isn't dependent on something someone else has done for us without even knowing it, perhaps. And far more people supporting us than we even know, right? But Ubuntu is this acknowledgement that the world is bigger than my fears, and that the world is bigger than our divisiveness. Ubuntu recognizes we're here because of one another. Now, how do we respond? So to love our neighbor is one thing, but to love our enemy is this challenge, not to simply be nice, not to simply say, okay, I recognize they just make mistakes, they're a bad person, but it's to recognize, no, I'm here because of them, they are here because of me. They have the image of God, imago Dei, within them. I have the image of God within me. We are all the image of God together. How do we get past? How do we get past the fear? Well, my suggestion is we begin to lose ourselves. We begin to lose ourselves even in the process of our fears. Now, I'll give you one quick example of how you can do that, one quick illustration. I tried to do it this past week, and I didn't get there, but some of my friends did. During the debate, some of my Democratic friends went to a Republican rally. They didn't go so they could sort of spy on the enemy. They went so they could understand what was their orientation, where were they coming from. And not simply just to understand, but to be convinced that their side was right. Now, they weren't necessarily convinced, and getting past all of that awareness, all of that training, all of that habituation is really difficult. But to begin to love our enemies is to begin to see our enemies as us. Amen.